Hi, welcome to part two of the lecture where I'll be talking about World War II and its aftermath. So, the first section of my lecture is on the section The Churches and Nazism, the Second World War. So, the probably the most critical fact is that during World War II, during the Nazi regime, obviously one of the great kind of moral evils of the 20th century, there was kind of an ambiguity in the way churches responded, going from Germany to all the territories that Germany conquered and occupied during the war. So, on one side, basically we could consider three positions. One is silent or passive with regard to Nazi power and genocide. One is compliant or supportive, even of the Nazi regime and its anti Semitism. And one is resistant or opposed to the Nazi power. And you could take even a single person, for instance, the Pope, more or less, the Pope, Pope Pius XII. He encapsulated all three of these at different times or in different ways during his papacy. So in terms of silence, he never condemned the Holocaust. He barely condemned it. He talked about the murders of peoples, but never specifically singled out the Jews. And he never apologized after the war. His papacy lasted 12 years after the war. He never apologized for his silence or openly made comments about the Jewish genocide. So there's this kind of silent or passive reaction to genocide or to the Holocaust, even to Nazism, to kind of a silence that's hard to understand what to read into it, but at very least is kind of a passive acceptance. So there's also kind of supportive. There's a support of the fact that he seemed to that silence seems kind of supportive of the Nazi regime, but there's also resistance in a sense too. In Pope Pius's the fact that Pius knew about the attempt to kill Hitler, and he didn't say anything about that either. And in fact, he passed on information, his knowledge of that attempt, to the Allied forces. So there's some level of resistance there. So there's some level of acceptance, a willingness to go along with the Nazi regime, some level of passivity, some level of resistance, all in a single person. So I think that's an interesting way to think about European responses. In Germany itself, there was a group called German Christians who supported the Nazis, who thought uh, that 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 the Nazis were purifying Christianity, were removing the Jewish element, both theologically and then even physically. Although it's not all of them knew, of course, of the extent of the Holocaust or supported that, but they did not like the fact that Christianity had Jewish roots, and they supported Nazi anti-Semitism in that sense. And then there were also Germans, both Protestant and Catholic, that opposed Nazism and paid by being jailed or even being killed for their beliefs. One of the famous ones is a theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, kind of a young pastor who bitterly opposed Nazis and even was involved or knew of the plot to kill Hitler and was killed because he was implicated. Then there are Eastern Europeans, for instance, non Protestants or non Germans moving out of the German sphere. Many Jews were in Poland or in Eastern Europe. Many of the Jews that eventually died in the Holocaust. And Eastern Europeans were a complex mixture of some Protestantism, but primarily Roman Catholicism or Orthodoxy, as we've seen before. And we have quite a range again of Eastern Europeans who have their own anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish prejudices, who cooperate enthusiastically even with the Nazis in handing over Jews or killing them, or other Eastern Europeans like Andrei Sheptitsky. We learned about this leader, this bishop, Ukrainian bishop in the text, who, at great personal risk, sheltered Jews, tried to save their lives, tried to save as many as he could, even created networks to try to save them. So, in all, there's kind of a complex response to Nazism, to the Holocaust, with Christians that Christians are still grappling with. It is important probably to clarify that Nazis themselves do not see themselves primarily as Christians. In fact, they often don't like Christianity. They were fascinated by paganism or occultism, and they didn't seem to have much use for Christians because of the underlying Christian claim of universality of all people being equal and because of the Jewish roots, but understanding that the people that they wanted to motivate and the people they were trying to take over were mostly Christians. They knew how to use Christian symbols like good politicians at that time who wanted power, who cared primarily for power. They knew how to use Christianity to divide Christians against themselves, to play churches against other churches, to build up a base of support, and to motivate their followers. So the Nazi legacy is complex, and Christians still are grappling with how to deal with these very difficult questions: Christian anti-Semitism, Christian Jewish roots, Christian responses to genocide. If we move on now to the last section, the second to last section is called World Christianity Realigned. We have two sections, both called World Christianity Realigned, and they look at two aspects, two responses to the future of world Christianity. And one of them is ecumenical beginnings. That's the section I'm talking about now. Next one is basically on Pentecostals. So as far as ecumenical beginnings are concerned, the end of World War II means that the balance of power and of Christianity is more and more away from Europe. As I've pointed out, Europe is devastated by war. Europe is where the war is happening, and so Europe is physically devastated, industrially, economically devastated, socially devastated, and religiously it follows as well. There's a loss of confidence in a lot of ways with European Christianity. Whereas at the beginning of the century, as I pointed out, there's all these Christian empires who are very confident and proud of their reach, having conquered the world at the high point of colonialism as well and imperialism. And by the end, they're kind of shattered. Their cities are in ruins, and they're trying to rebuild after destroying each other in war. And there's a real question: what role does Christianity play in this? And so there's the Christians that are growing are in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and we're going to hear more about this and learn more about this in the next section. But for now, we can say that one response to the war and to these kind of self doubts and questions about Christianity is this liberal. That's what this section is about. It's kind of the liberal response, the ecumenical so called response. And I'll explain both of these. Of course, liberalism is a very difficult to define idea. I've talked about in this class, generally defining it with the Enlightenment, classic liberalism at least, not modern political liberal in America, but liberal here, when we talk about Protestants, about Christianity, are kinds of Christians who, when faced with these kind of questions, when faced with the aftermath of World War II and thinking about how to go forward, they really turn to social activism. They turn to ideas of justice on a social level, institutional justice. They de-emphasize this kind of traditional gospel of salvation, and they emphasize instead this idea that Christians should be involved in reforming, rebuilding society, reaching out to the poor, getting reforms made, creating practical ways of helping other people, so that they still might be interested in mission, but their mission might be to create hospitals, to create schools, to create other church type institutions that really help all of society. They try to benefit society, and that's their definition of what a church can be and what a church should be. The other part of it, so it's tied deeply to the modern world and also to Western culture in a way that they're not that aware of, perhaps. Even when they try to bring their ideas or good hospitals. A good hospital doesn't seem political or cultural, but it really puts kind of a Western cultural impact in many of these non-Western cultures where they're building these new hospitals and schools in Africa and again and in Asia and also to Latin America. And the other part of their project is this thing called ecumenism. It's an old word. It's a strange word maybe to you all. It's from Greek. Ecumeni, or just means the whole world, the whole inhabited earth. And so ecumenical is kind of this Christian movement to tie other Christian groups together, to try to heal some of the wounds in old Christianity. These Orthodox Catholic Protestants that have been involved in war now, murdering each other after World War I, after World War II, that one of the responses, again, a more liberal response, which again this is what we're defining as liberal, is interest in social concerns. In this case, liberal for Protestants and for Christians is interest in social concerns, and also liberal is now trying to create Christian unity in this kind of way through institutions, through board meetings and getting theologians together and getting church leaders together in the same room. And they're not that successful. There's a good example. The book focuses a lot on Anglicans because Anglicans are the British Church, if you remember, the Church of England, that is somewhat Catholic, somewhat Protestant. And so they seem like an ideal place. They know, the Protestant Anglicans know a lot of evangelicals and Protestants. The Catholic Anglicans know Orthodox and Catholic theologians. They try to bring it together, but the fact is they can't even unify within themselves. They can't decide what Anglicanism is, and they can't really decide either how to bring these different groups together. So the ecumenical project largely fails, or we could say it's ongoing at least. But from this liberal side, this kind of push for unity, this kind of push for social justice and social involvement of churches, that is one response to the modern world. The second response, which is in this second section on world Christianity, the realignment, world Christianity realigned Pentecostals and new churches. This is one of the reasons why the ecumenical project, at least in that sense, does not succeed, is because there are a lot of Christians that are not involved in this project. They're not the mainline, fancy, middle class, respectable Christians that have boards and famous theologians and that kind of thing to create dialogues, and bishops even. They're popping up all over the world, but so far they're kind of under the radar. And this is one of the most important groups, actually. We don't talk about it much in this book, but our next book will be very focused on these. So I wanted to spend a good amount of time on these, at least, so that we have some idea what's coming up. Ecumenism is not that relevant because the vast majority of future Christians, and even at that time, the growing number of Christians are not part of, again, these Christian groups. They're part of new churches, and they're part of some groups that we could call Pentecostal or charismatic, if you've ever heard those terms. And even if you haven't, the kind of Christianity the kind of Christianity in 2020 that you're probably familiar with, is very influenced by Pentecostal or charismatic one way or another. Even liberal Christians have had to realign themselves or rethink because the obvious center of energy is here. And one reason no one heard about them, one reason no one saw this coming, is because Pentecostals were really under the radar for a long time. They were under the radar because they formed so many groups. There's so many of them, it's hard to even understand that they're one group. They fight amongst themselves, they fight with other Christians. But more or less, these are the Christians, we could say, that really emphasize the immediate presence of the Spirit, whether it's the gifts of the Spirit, whether it's knowing the Spirit directly, the Spirit giving revelation or speaking. The people who can really say, I have this kind of personal relationship with Jesus, and Jesus is the Spirit. And now the lines are always going to be blurry, but we can see one example of their emphasis on Jesus and the Spirit in this group that becomes controversial and creates a controversy within the Pentecostal movement, which is oneness Pentecostals, who say everything is in Jesus' name, and that in fact the Father, Son, and Spirit are all different names of Jesus. They only have one God, which is Jesus. Now this is a big controversy because Christians decided, basically most Protestants, almost all other Protestants, Catholics and Orthodox, all decided many years ago in these councils of the church, when they gathered all those bishops back hundreds of years ago, more than 1,000 years ago, they decided that God was three and one. That's why we have ideas of the Trinity or the triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit. The idea was there are three persons in one God. And of course, this is very confusing. What do you mean by both three and one? Well, the oneness Pentecostal position was long ago condemned as a heresy, but it kind of came back again, this idea, and is quite popular in these groups. And it just shows the emphasis on Jesus, and emphasis on knowing Jesus, but also the Spirit in a way, because it's baptism in the Spirit, baptism in Jesus' name and by Jesus' name. So there's another reason they're not known, is because they hid under the umbrella of something called evangelicalism, which we've met before, kind of an older form of Protestant Christianity, an older form that emphasized, we talked about the Enlightenment, both the sinfulness of human beings, but also the power of individual conversion. That's a very modern movement in some ways, talking about, I know I was saved on such and such a date. Well, the Pentecostals come out of this movement and attack it at the same time. They're kind of a new growth, a new development we could consider within evangelicalism that starts to eat up its ancestors, starts to maybe in a less controversial or violent ways, just really starting to grow from within it and take it over in some sense. But there are differences. There are still evangelicals and still Pentecostals. Evangelicals tend to emphasize logic and the Word and study of the Word. Pentecostals love the Word of God also, but they tend to emphasize more intuition, like I said, a direct feeling of the Spirit, a direct gift of the Spirit. Speaking in tongues is a good example. It's not supposed to be rational. It's not supposed to be something you think through, but you just have the Spirit come upon you, and the power of the Spirit allows you to speak in supposedly in a new tongue, a strange tongue, a tongue of angels, or a foreign language. And so this is the Pentecostals, or prophecy is another example. The ability to speak from God, speak with special knowledge, and Pentecostals, this is not exactly rational or logical. So Pentecostals and evangelicals will fight over the extent to which Christians can accept these kind of new gifts of the Spirit. Now, the Pentecostal approach to poverty, again, is quite different from the one we've seen. So, whereas liberal Christians wanted to emphasize institutions, changes, reforms, uh, Pentecostals also are interested in poverty because many of them are from poor, working class, or lower class kind of people. But Pentecostalism could be seen as maybe the largest self motivated, self organized movement of the urban poor ever in history. So, instead of a communist revolution, like Marx thought, the poor have organized themselves, but they've organized themselves into many different kinds of these Pentecostal churches, which may not even agree with each other. But when you step back and look from a distance, you realize it is a giant movement of the poor, by the poor, for the poor. And their answer is not so much we need to get new reforms passed, we need to change tax policies, we need to vote a certain way. Their answer, although there are political implications, their main answer is we need to have faith and we need to get right with the Spirit, and the Spirit can bless me, can prosper me, can help me flourish in my life. With the confidence of the Spirit inside, I can make my life better, and the Spirit can make my life better, more or less. And there's even specific movements called word of faith movements and such that are very popular throughout the world. Whereas if you speak something with faith or pray it with faith, God will grant it to you. And of course, these are controversial for different reasons. The ideas of Jesus and wealth are complex, I'll say to say the least, because Jesus himself seems to, by most accounts, have been a poor, even embracing his poverty as a preacher. And so the Pentecostals are joining this party, are growing more and more. And like I said, most of our class in the future will deal with these kind of people, whether we call them Pentecostal or charismatic, simply because they're so successful that they've kind of Pentecostalized or charismaticized all of Christianity. And it's really the future of Christianity we're thinking about with these groups. But they really join at a time when evangelicals have reached their highest strength and are really suffered some very big public setbacks in North America, at least in the United States. And so their strength helps bolster or strengthen evangelicals at a weak point. Just when evangelicals are hiding from culture because of these big setbacks, Pentecostals are joining them, kind of hiding underground, so to speak, creating their own underground subcultures, not participating in mainstream cultures. And the two big blows to evangelical or conservative Christian pride are the so-called Scopes monkey trial, where Clarence Darrow basically humiliates William Jennings Bryan, these two lawyers, kind of famous lawyers. The one arguing to try to he technically loses the case. Scopes is trying to teach evolution in a Tennessee school, but in the public press, he's not allowed to teach. Basically, Tennessee successfully for that time bans him from teaching evolution. In the public press, really, Scopes, the team that's defending the state of Tennessee, the team that's defending the conservative Christian side to try to squash the teaching of evolution, gets humiliated, and really as being kind of illogical, as being not thoughtful, not up to date, not modern, ancient, and this is one big setback. And the second big one, probably even bigger, is the fact that conservative Christians were so strong in pushing temperance, pushing abolition. Alcohol causes a lot of social harms, and so they were trying to remove it from society, but they overreached. If you know the story, it's often talked about crime and all these things, but it also has an urban-rural divide, which continues in politics today. And the fact is, the bottom line is that they succeeded, but then they failed. You know, the larger story failed. They won a battle and they lost the war. They got the amendment passed, but then the amendment was repealed, and that really again humiliated in a way conservative Christians and caused them to think we've overstepped. We can't get involved in politics and in the wider world. Just when Pentecostals are joining them more, and so they all kind of hide together instead of trying to influence the major universities and talk about the cultural debates. They hide for a number of decades until they come back, kind of in the modern conservative political right. That's another story that's actually next week's lecture. But for now, we can just see that this is the story in the United States, and that through the United States, actually, partly, and through the fact that these are very global people, and that this is a very portable kind of teaching. I mean, anybody can say they have the Spirit. As soon as you hear this idea, you can experience it yourself if you want to. If you're a Christian and you're thinking about in these terms, you could pray for the Spirit. Pray for special gifts and start to practice them, start to teach them. And it gives you a real remarkable kind of authority. You don't have to go to a seminary. You don't have to spend years. You can just, yesterday you were not a Christian. Today you are a Christian, and you have the power of the Spirit. You're fully authorized to go and teach and make other disciples. You can see how this spreads very quickly. You can go from 0 to 100 very, very quickly, until you're spreading, and then all the people you pass the message to spread it to another 10 people and another 10, and it grows. Like these days we think about it going viral, and that Pentecostalism really does. It spreads through networks in North America to throughout Latin America. Religion there, Christianity there has been Catholic for a long time, but starts to get challenged by these kind of Pentecostal, evangelical, conservative Christian, and spirit-filled movements, so that even the Catholic Church adapts and becomes what we call charismatic. They stay Catholic, but they emphasize the Spirit. Africa, Asia, these regions are all growing with prophets, with churches teaching prosperity, with various kinds of Pentecostal-like and spirit-filled teachings. And again, we'll come back to this. This is probably a good place to stop and a good beginning for you to understand where we're headed for the rest of this class, and what the aftermath of the war is. These two responses at the end of the war. One is a more liberal response, emphasizing institutions, changing in society, and reform, and also trying to bring Christians together through a kind of a top-down approach, theologians and elites and bishops. The other is kind of bottom-up, and this one really is the one that starts to grow with like grassroots movements do, with many people all around the world embracing the power of the Spirit to change their lives. Okay, thank you.